Nothing can equal the prestige of the Republic of Venice in the late 17th century. Also known as La Serenissima, the Republic was about to celebrate its 900th anniversary. The lagoon city was wealthy, cosmopolitan, free, and openly proud of its independence from Rome and the Pope. Accounts by travelers reinforce the legend. Venice was breathtakingly beautiful, a festive metropolis with unbridled pomp. Visitors would get lost in its labyrinthine alleys, stare in wonder at its innumerable bridges, and in awe at this urban miracle built in stone over a lagoon. Throughout Europe, people spoke of the magnificent palazzos constructed on the banks of the Grand Canal and of the dazzling artworks that adorned them, churches and monasteries. Venice was enjoying its artistic peak. Three painters of genius, Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese, sang its praises on canvas. It's 1563. Veronese is 35 years old. After 15 months of work, he finally completes his work, The Wedding at Cana. The painting hangs in the Benedictine monastery of San Giorgio Maggiore, located on a small island opposite the Doge's palace on the other side of the Grand Canal. What do we see? A monumental oil painting filling the entire width of the wall at the back. We can't take our eyes off it. It looks like an extension of the room that opens onto a terrace under a blue sky. In the lower section, a crowd of brightly dressed people are partying around a long series of banquet tables. What lies behind this mass gathering framed by striking architecture? To find out, we must examine the features, colors, and gestures used in the painting to uncover the secrets of its composition, to understand what it is telling us about a period, a city, and a republic. The monastery of San Giorgio Maggiore was one of the wealthiest in Venice. Prestigious guests, ambassadors, politicians, and princely figures often stayed within its walls when visiting the city. The monks wanted a sumptuous painting to decorate their refectory. With Veronese, they chose the festive subject of the wedding at Cana, the scene of Christ's first miracle. At the end of a wedding banquet in the small town of Cana in Galilee, the wine runs out. The mother of Jesus, Mary, asks her son to help, and he fills jars of water with wine. The monk's commission was very precise. The contract stipulated that the work should give the illusion of extending the space designed by the architect Palladio and contain as many figures as possible. It also insisted on its size, 70 square meters, and colors. Veronese painted 133 people in first-choice colors, as stated in the contract. Like all Venetian painters, he had the finest quality pigments, rare and precious and shipped in from the Orient, like lapis lazuli, which produced ultramarine blue, orpiment for deep yellow, cinnabar for vermilion, and ruby sulfur for orangey red. But none other than Veronese could obtain these subtle and sensual tones. With incredible talent, he harmoniously distributed colors, varying their different qualities, darker as he thickened the layers, or lighter when mixing them with white lead pigment. The staging in Veronese's canvas is perfectly ordered. He set the scene on a terrace, overlooked by a balustrade and bordered on each side by monuments. The verticality of the columns contrasts with the horizontality of the upper terrace. The upper section, almost empty, lights the ensemble. The banquet takes place in the foreground in a tight frontal space contained by the balustrade, increasing the impression of chaos. And yet, the painting of the period was already leaning towards more ambitious perspectives, which draw the eye of the viewer into the illusion of depth. Tintoretto had painted his own wedding at Cana 2 years earlier, and his work was dominated by a vertiginous perspective. Here, nothing is so demonstrative. The ensemble gives the impression of a theater stage from antiquity. When Veronese was painting the wedding at Cana, the architect Palladio was drawing the plans for the Teatro Olimpico, which would be built several years later in Vicenza. Like Veronese, he didn't have the same concerns as his contemporaries, who were seeking to add depth to the scenic space. He drew inspiration from the architecture of Vitruvius, who defined the structure of the ancient Roman theater. His stage offered similarities that were very close to the scenic space imagined by Veronese. The reason Veronese designed his painting like a stage presentation is because he wanted to tell the story as told in the Gospel of St. John. So the people featured are actors. The viewer's eye is invited to wander over the entire surface of the canvas to follow the biblical text. The story is fairly simple. It starts in the center with Christ, immobile, yet seemingly the origin of the agitation taking place around him. Let's look at St. John's telling of the wedding step by step. "They have no more wine," says Mary, miming with her hand an absent glass. Jesus remains immobile, unaware of the unfolding drama. "Woman, my time has not yet come." Mary takes charge of things, telling the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Jesus finally decides, "Fill the jars with water," he orders, as impassive as ever. To everyone's surprise, a miracle occurs. A servant pours from one of the jars of water, but the liquid is red. It's wine. The master of the feast tastes the wine and admires its color. Across the terrace, a black slave offers a glass to the bridegroom, and the master of the feast openly declares, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine, but you have kept the good wine until now." The guests are overcome with curiosity. The bride expresses her surprise. Her neighbor asks where the wine has appeared from. The African prince turns to a servant to ask for a glass. The sleeping beauty in the background wakes up. Her neighboring guest also asks for a glass. The rumor continues to spread. In a single instant, Veronese captured a whole series of events. The stage is set. The worst has been avoided. There is wine, the wedding banquet can continue, and the musicians can begin to play. In the 18th century, the art critic Antonio Maria Zanetti claimed that Veronese had had fun representing himself in the company of Titian and Tintoretto. "The bass player is none other than Titian," he wrote, concerning the man in red. He went on, "To his right, Paolo painted himself as a violist in white. As for the musician in the middle, one would categorically believe that this is Tintoretto." This hypothesis, coming some 200 years after the work was painted, is proof of how the three painters dominated the Venetian art scene of the time. Titian was the most dominant of the three due to his long life, making him a contemporary of both Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci. He was the Republic's official painter, and his reputation spread far beyond Venice and the borders of Italy. In 1548, Tintoretto painted The Miracle of the Slave. The work was noticed, and Titian felt threatened. To counter the artist he considered a rival, he had the young Veronese come to Venice and openly supported him. The emergence of new artists was encouraged by the competitions which decided state commissions. Veronese's talent and the influential backing of Titian soon elevated Veronese to an important position. French painter Eugène Delacroix, who had spent a long time observing the wedding at Cana, wrote in his diary on July the 10th, 1847, "Paolo Veronese does not display the pretension of trying to produce a masterpiece with each painting. This skill of not doing too much everywhere, this apparent insouciance for details which gives such simplicity, is due to regular work in decoration." Decoration, the term had been uttered. Was Veronese simply painting an elegant decorative work for the refectory designed by Palladio? Indeed, the cornices of the refectory do appear to rest on those in the painting to the left and right. But Veronese was not merely using Palladio's building. He used the architecture to structure his painting. Veronese had a very fine sense of space and form, along with a pronounced love of architecture. He was a son of a spezzapreda, a stone craftsman, a blend of mason, sculptor, and architect. Before settling on painting, he started out as his father's apprentice. A few years before the wedding at Cana, Veronese had painted the decoration at the Villa Barbaro in Masser, also built by Palladio. The painting was treated as trompe-l'oeil, with arches opening onto unlikely gardens, false doors giving glimpses of colorful people. Veronese was redesigning the architecture of Palladio's villa. Architecture was essential to Veronese, as it was to Venice. The city was one of the most densely populated in Italy and was continually expanding. Its urban planning was unique in Europe and extremely dense for the time. Renaissance architects deeply changed its appearance. Palladio benefited from his great renown and built palazzos and villas, religious and public buildings. His churches durably marked the urban landscape of Venice. He offered a symmetrical, pared-down architecture, the balance and harmony of which rested on respecting the three architectural orders of antiquity: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. But somewhat like a painter, he gave importance not only to the structure and proportions of his buildings, but also to the effects that distance, light, and air density could have on how they were seen. Whenever Veronese was commissioned to paint a work for Venice, he opted for oils on canvas, even for large-scale works, because the damp and sea air degrade mural frescoes. Like other artists, Veronese headed a studio that employed 30 or so people, and he set up a production system that enabled him to produce an impressive number of paintings. He prepared his compositions by doing very precise sketches. His assistants then transferred them to scale on canvas. The purchase of materials and the preparation of colors was carried out by his team, so he could dedicate himself to the painting of his figures. For the wedding at Cana, he sketched each figure with a large brush. Then, even before the paint had dried, he worked on the details with a fine brush. The speed of his execution was impressive. Unlike Tintoretto and Titian, he rarely changed the structure of a work once he started it. His brother Benedetto was a member of his team. He's thought to have worked on the upper part of the tableau, painting the architectural elements and the sky. Of course, La Serenissima was rich and commissions were numerous, but the city did more than just guarantee its artists an income. It was also a haven of stability unequaled in history. The Republic of Venice lasted for over 1,000 years and would cross the 16th century more or less unharmed, while wars raged across the rest of Italy. It owed its longevity to a political system designed so that a single family was unable to take complete control of the city. The Great Council, the supreme political organ of the Republic, was composed of all nobles aged at least 25. Each member of the council had the right to be elected to the ducal throne after a complex procedure involving voting, the drawing of lots, and designations. Once elected, the Doge's power was strictly monitored. He wasn't allowed to make any political acts alone, nor even to open the letters from ambassadors and provincial rectors addressed to him. He was even unable to leave Venice without 2 appointed advisors at his side. In the 16th century, La Serenissima was faced with financial competition from other European ports. Christopher Columbus had opened up the seas and trade routes were multiplying, meaning that merchandise from the Indies, which formerly arrived in Venice, was being delivered elsewhere. There was also danger from the Turks. The expansion of the Ottoman Empire was depriving Venice of its colonies and trading posts in the Middle East. Venetian art, however, was in its heyday. More than ever, the Republic was affirming its independence from the Holy See in Rome, both in politics and in religious matters. An old saying went, "Venetians believe enormously in Saint Mark, quite a lot in God, and little or not at all in the Pope." The reason Titian, Veronese, and Tintoretto, among many other artists, remained in Venice was mainly because La Serenissima gave them so much freedom to practice their art as they pleased. Veronese was free to paint the profane feast that constituted his wedding at Caná, without the threat of censure by the Inquisition. But that doesn't mean he ignored religious symbolism. Above the feast, at the exact point where the vertical and horizontal median lines cross, just above the head of Jesus, 2 butchers are filleting meat. Under the table is a gourd containing the animal's blood. Flesh and blood, an allusion to Christ, the Lamb of God slaughtered on the cross, and to the Eucharist, in which bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ during Mass. Lower down, the mortal condition of man is evoked in the hourglass on the table in front of the musicians, who, in turn, symbolize the ages of life. Combining the sacred and the profane is typical of Veronese's work. Like in The Pilgrims of Emmaus or The Adoration of the Virgin by the Coccina family, he blends a biblical episode with a scene from the present. This juxtaposition was a personal taste, but it also responded to a new wish from the Church to make religious scenes more accessible and familiar to the general public. Everything in the wedding at Caná seems to suggest that Veronese was inspired by Aretino, who in 1535, in his 3 volumes of the Humanity of Christ, compared this biblical episode to the pomp of the Renaissance. Aretino wrote, "All the grandest, noblest people of the city attended this wedding at Caná," adding that it was a wedding of regal pomp. Known as the Scourge of Princes, Aretino was a free-thinking satirist who knew no limits. Having survived an assassination attempt, he found refuge in Venice, far from the ire of the Holy See. Reputed to be a big drinker, he must have appreciated this city where the faulty water supply system encouraged people to drink wine rather than the doubtfully tasting water. Legend has it that he died during a particularly wine-fueled meal, laughing hysterically at an obscene joke. Veronese's work, perhaps, more simply reflects the crowning of the dogaressa, Zilia Priuli, which took place shortly before he began painting The Wedding at Cana. After 9 unmarried doges, Lorenzo Priuli brought a woman to the throne at his side. The banquet was particularly splendid. According to one chronicler, the city hadn't seen such magnificence for over a century. Veronese, like some of his fellow painters, designed stage costumes, as we can see in these sketches, accompanied with notes which indicate their progress. In The Wedding at Cana, Veronese transformed the world and its fashions into something extraordinary and symbolic. He exaggerated postures, amplified proportions and movements, and overstated the luxuriousness of the clothes. He was thus setting a scene in the theatrical sense of the term. In The Wedding at Cana, there's a huge variety of dress, fabrics, and jewelry. These flamboyant clothes, anachronistic for a scene from the Bible, troubled a number of critics over the following centuries. In the 18th century, Jean-Joseph Taillasson wrote, "How ridiculous to imagine that all the Eastern pomp and richness could be unfurled at the wedding of a lowly bourgeois from a small town in Galilee. It is such an unlikely expression." German author Goethe defended Veronese against these accusations. Whoever finds it fit to criticize a painter for the dress should consider that he had to paint a 16th century story, and that is that. Veronese's fondness for scene setting led him to add thousands of picturesque details to his painting. These details exasperated Delacroix, who wrote in his diary, on a day when he was in a foul mood. Whether he was painting Christ or a bourgeois from Venice, they're still wearing dressing gowns. His blue backgrounds and small Negroes holding lapdogs. But it is true that all is arranged in harmony with the lines and colors. But Veronese's work is neither a faithful reproduction of biblical Galilee nor of 16th century Venice. Over the 10 years that followed the success of The Wedding at Cana, the artist produced 6 paintings inspired by biblical feasts, all equally abundant and free. The last one, The Last Supper, earned a summons to face the Inquisition. The inquisitors felt it was inappropriate to include animals and people not wearing clothes from the time of Christ in a religious painting. All fantasy was forbidden. The censors accused him of drawing on the Gospels as a pretext for depicting a trivial scene. Veronese apologized and explained, "When I have some space left over in a picture, I adorn it with figures of my own invention. We painters use the same license as poets and madmen." He was ordered to modify the painting. He simply renamed it Feast in the House of Levi. Veronese got off lightly, but for him, it was the end of his dream of independence and freedom. The wind was changing. La Serenissima was beginning to yield to the Holy See, which sought to make use of the overflowing imagination of artists to counter increasing Protestantism, which largely rejected all religious imagery. The city began to decline. 2 centuries later, General Napoleon Bonaparte would invade Venice. He handed over the city to the Austrians, who annexed it as a province of its empire. And, as a so-called war trophy, Napoleon took The Wedding at Cana with him back to France.